A group of Apache warrior women took shelter in my cabin. One whispered, "I saw the cowboy first." The evening came quietly at first. The sky was heavy, gray, and low, the kind that made the land feel smaller and the silence deeper. The cowboy had lived alone in that small wooden cabin for years. It sat far from the main road, surrounded by tall trees, rough ground, and open land that stretched farther than the eye could see. He liked it that way. The quiet helped him think, helped him breathe. He had just finished bringing firewood inside when the wind suddenly changed. It rushed through the trees with a sharp sound, bending branches and pulling loose leaves into the air. He looked up at the sky and knew what was coming. A storm was moving fast, stronger than usual. He secured the door, checked the windows, and added more wood to the fire. Rain started falling hard, hitting the roof like stones. Thunder rolled across the land, deep and long. The cabin shook slightly with each strong gust of wind. The cowboy sat near the fire listening. Storms were nothing new to him. He had learned long ago how to wait them out. Then, through the sound of rain and thunder, he heard something else. A knock. At first, he thought it might be the wind hitting the door. But then it came again, clear, firm, and human. His body stiffened. No one ever came out here, especially not during a storm like this. He stood slowly, his hand resting near the door, listening again. Another knock followed. He opened the door carefully. Cold rain rushed inside, along with the sharp smell of wet earth. Standing there were several women soaked from the storm, their faces calm but alert. They stood close together like a unit. Their eyes scanned the area before settling on him. They did not look lost. They looked prepared even in the rain. One of them spoke. Her voice was steady and respectful. They asked for shelter until the storm passed. The cowboy looked at them for a moment. He noticed how they carried themselves, straight backs, focused eyes, quiet strength. These were not ordinary travelers. Still, the storm was dangerous and the night was growing darker by the minute. He stepped aside and nodded. "Come in," he said simply. They entered the cabin one by one, careful not to bring too much rain inside. The space was small but warm. The fire burned steadily, casting orange light across the wooden walls. The door closed behind them, and for a moment no one spoke. The women removed their wet outer clothing and placed it near the fire. Their movements were efficient, almost silent. They seemed used to working together without many words. The cowboy noticed how they positioned themselves around the room, not crowding him, but not leaving their backs unprotected either. He poured water to boil and prepared simple food. He did not ask many questions. He had learned that real respect often meant knowing when to stay quiet. He offered them warm drinks and they accepted with polite nods. Outside, the storm grew louder. Rain fell harder and thunder cracked sharply overhead. The cabin felt like a small island against the power of the weather. As they sat, the cowboy felt the weight of their presence, not threatening but serious. These women carried stories in their eyes, stories shaped by land, struggle, and responsibility. He wondered where they had come from and where they were going, but he kept those thoughts to himself. One of the women stood slightly apart from the others. She was quiet, watching the fire, watching him. Her gaze was thoughtful, as if she were measuring something deeper than the room. As the wind howled outside, the women spoke softly among themselves in low tones. Their words were calm, controlled, and purposeful. The cowboy did not understand the language, but he understood the mood. There was trust among them. Then, in a moment so quiet it almost vanished under the sound of rain, the woman who had been watching him leaned toward the others and whispered something. "I saw the cowboy first." The words were soft, but they landed heavily in the room. The others turned their eyes briefly toward her, then toward him. The cowboy felt a strange tightening in his chest. He did not know what she meant. He was certain he had never met her before. He said nothing. He only kept his posture relaxed, his hands open, his tone steady. Whatever her words meant, he sensed they were important. The storm trapped them together. Time slowed. The fire crackled. The rain showed no sign of stopping. The cabin, which had always felt empty and quiet, now held an energy it had never known. The cowboy realized that this night was not just about shelter from the storm. Something else was happening, something quiet, something human, a meeting not planned but necessary. Outside, thunder rolled again, long and low. Inside, strangers shared warmth, silence, and a fragile sense of safety. And the cowboy knew that when the storm finally passed, this night would remain with him forever. The wind slammed against the cabin walls once more, as if testing them. Inside, the fire burned low. Inside, the small space stayed warm, but the air felt heavy with many unspoken things. The cowboy added more wood to the fire. Sparks rose briefly before settling into glowing red embers. The light danced on the faces of the women, showing calm expressions, sharp eyes, and quiet strength. They sat in a loose circle, close enough to share warmth but not crowding one another. No one rushed to speak. Silence was not uncomfortable here. It felt earned. After some time, one of the women thanked him again for letting them stay. Her words were simple and respectful. The cowboy nodded and replied just as simply. He said the land could be harsh, and no one should face a storm alone if help was nearby. That seemed to matter to them. They accepted the food he offered. It was plain, nothing special, but they treated it with appreciation. They ate slowly, carefully, as if used to making the most of whatever was available. The cowboy noticed how they shared without discussion, passing items to one another without being asked. As the hours passed, small details emerged. One woman checked the door quietly from time to time, making sure it was secure. Another watched the window, reading the storm like a map. These were habits built over years. They were protectors by nature. The cowboy remained near the fire. He did not try to control the space or dominate the room. He understood that trust was fragile, especially between people who came from different paths. So he stayed calm, open, and patient. The whispered words from earlier stayed in his mind. I saw the cowboy first. He wondered what that meant. Had she seen him somewhere before? Or did she mean something else, something deeper? He did not ask. If the meaning was meant to be shared, it would come in time. The storm forced the night to stretch longer than usual. Sleep came in short moments, broken by thunder and wind. Some of the women rested with their eyes closed, but their awareness never fully left. The cowboy noticed this and respected it. He knew that real rest did not always mean sleep. At one point, the fire grew low again. He stood quietly to add more wood. As he did, the woman who had whispered earlier looked up at him. Their eyes met briefly. There was no fear in her gaze, only recognition, like someone seeing a familiar shape in the distance. She looked away first. The cowboy sat back down, feeling a strange pull in his chest. He could not explain it. He had lived alone for a long time and he was used to the quiet. But now the quiet felt different. It felt shared. Hours later, the storm finally began to weaken. The rain softened and the wind lost its sharp edge. The sound outside changed from chaos to steady dripping. The night slowly gave way to early morning. A soft gray light entered through the window. The women began to stir. They moved with purpose, gathering their things, checking their gear, preparing without noise. The cowboy offered more warm drinks and they accepted. Morning always felt like a second chance, and this one felt especially meaningful. As they sat together in the pale light, one of the women began to speak about the land, not in long stories but in short reflections. She spoke of responsibility, of walking paths with care, of knowing when to move and when to stay still. The others listened closely. The cowboy understood more than she realized. He had learned similar lessons, just in different ways. From animals, from weather, from long days and longer nights. Another woman mentioned their journey. They were returning from something important, something tied to their people. She did not explain further, and the cowboy did not ask. Some things were not meant for outsiders, and he respected that boundary. The woman who had whispered earlier finally spoke again. Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. She explained that sometimes a moment stands out, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it reveals who someone truly is. The cowboy listened carefully. She said that people often see others through fear or history. But sometimes someone acts without knowing they are being watched, and that is when their true self shows. The cowboy felt his throat tighten slightly. He still did not fully understand, but he felt the direction of her words. The storm outside was now gone. The land looked washed clean, fresh and quiet. Sunlight touched the edges of the trees. Birds began to return cautiously at first. The women stood and prepared to leave. They thanked the cowboy again, each in her own way. There were nods, small smiles, gestures of respect. The woman who had whispered lingered for a moment. She looked around the cabin once more, then at him. She did not repeat her earlier words. She did not explain them either. But in her eyes, the cowboy saw something clear: acknowledgement. They stepped outside together. The air was cool and fresh. The storm had passed, but its memory remained, just like the night they had shared. As the women walked away, moving confidently across the land, the cowboy stood at his cabin door and watched until they disappeared from view. He felt changed. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way he could easily explain, but something inside him had shifted. The land felt wider. The silence felt deeper, and the idea of strangers felt different now. He closed the door slowly, the quiet returning, but not the same quiet as before. The storm had brought more than rain. It had brought understanding. Morning arrived gently, as if it did not want to disturb what the night had created. Thin light slipped through the cabin window, touching the wooden floor and the edges of the table. The storm was fully gone now. Only the soft sound of water dripping from leaves and the distant call of birds remained. The cowboy woke early, as he always did. He sat quietly for a moment, listening. The cabin felt different than it ever had before. It was still small, still simple, but it carried the memory of voices, footsteps, and shared warmth. The women were already awake. They moved calmly, checking their belongings, tightening straps, and folding items with care. There was no rush, but there was purpose. The cowboy poured fresh water and placed it near the fire to warm. He did not speak right away. He had learned that mornings often revealed more than nights, if one was patient. As the light grew stronger, the land outside became clear. The trees stood tall and clean, washed by the rain. The ground was dark and rich. Everything looked renewed, as if the storm had reset the world. They gathered around the small table for one last simple meal. No one complained about the plain food. Gratitude was shown through quiet nods and shared glances. The cowboy noticed how the women watched one another, always aware, always connected. It reminded him of how animals moved in groups, guided by trust and shared understanding. As they ate, the woman who had whispered the night before sat across from him. In the daylight, he could see her more clearly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were thoughtful, as if they carried stories that did not need to be spoken loudly. After a while, she spoke. She said she owed him an explanation. The room became still, not tense, but focused. The others did not interrupt. They trusted her to speak when the time was right. She told him that some years ago she had seen him before, not close, not face to face. She had been traveling with others, moving quietly through the land. From a distance, she had watched him help a family whose vehicle had broken down during extreme heat. He had shared water, given directions, and waited until help arrived. He had not asked who they were or where they came from. He had not expected thanks. He had simply helped. The cowboy listened, surprised. The memory came back slowly. He remembered the heat, the dust, the silence of the road. He had not thought much of it afterward. To him, it was just the right thing to do. She said that moment stayed with her. She explained that often people changed when they believed no one was watching, but he had not changed. He had acted from instinct, from care. That was why she whispered what she did the night before. She had recognized him, not his face, but his way. "I saw the cowboy first," she said again softly. "Before fear, before stories, before distance." The cowboy felt something tighten in his chest. He did not know how to respond at first. He had never considered that simple actions could travel so far, or stay alive in someone else's memory. He told her he did not feel special. He said the land taught him to help when he could, because someday he might need help too. She nodded. She said that was exactly the point. The others smiled faintly, not loudly, but with approval. This was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for truth. They spoke for some time after that, not in long speeches, but in shared thoughts. They talked about the land and how it remembered everything, every step, every choice. They talked about responsibility, about watching over places and people even when no one asked you to. The cowboy shared how he had come to live alone. He did not go into detail. He spoke simply about choosing quiet, choosing distance, choosing a life where his actions mattered more than his words. The women listened. They did not judge. They understood the need for space, for healing, for self-reliance. Eventually, they prepared to leave. The cowboy offered to walk with them for a short distance. The land beyond his cabin could be tricky after heavy rain, and he knew safer paths. They accepted his offer. Outside, the air was cool and clean. Their footsteps pressed gently into the soft ground. The land felt alive beneath them. As they walked, they shared more stories, not secrets but lessons. How to read changes in the wind, how to listen to silence, how to know when danger was near and when it was only fear pretending to be danger. The cowboy shared his own knowledge, where the ground stayed firm, where water collected, where animals moved after storms. It felt natural, like two parts of the same language meeting. At a certain point, the path split. This was where they would go on alone. They stopped. There were no long goodbyes, no promises to meet again, just respect. The woman who had recognized him stepped forward. She thanked him not just for the shelter, but for being who he was, even when no one was watching. The cowboy nodded. He said the land belonged to all who treated it with care. They turned and walked away, strong and steady, blending into the landscape as if they had always been part of it. The cowboy stood there for a while, watching until they were gone. When he returned to his cabin, it felt quiet again, but not empty. He understood now that the storm had brought more than visitors. It had brought a reminder that small acts mattered, that recognition did not always come immediately, and that respect could cross any distance when it was real. He sat near the fire, letting the morning settle around him, knowing that some nights stayed with a person forever, not because they were loud, but because they were true. The land felt different after they left. The cowboy noticed it as soon as he stepped back onto the familiar path near his cabin. Nothing had changed on the surface. The trees stood where they always had. The wind moved the same way through the grass. But something inside him had shifted, like the ground after rain settled, yet renewed. For the next few days he returned to his routine. He repaired a loose fence, checked the trail near the creek, and gathered supplies. Life continued, steady and quiet. Still, his thoughts often drifted back to the women and the calm strength they carried with them. He found himself paying closer attention to the land, as if listening for something he had missed before. He noticed patterns more clearly, the way birds returned to certain trees, the way animals avoided certain paths after storms. It reminded him of the lessons shared during that short walk together. He realized he had learned just as much as he had taught. One afternoon, while checking a far boundary of his land, he noticed fresh tracks. They were careful, light, and purposeful, not careless wandering. He stopped and studied them, respecting their presence rather than feeling threatened by it. Whoever passed through knew how to move without disturbing the land. That night, as the sun set low and painted the sky in soft colors, the cowboy sat on the cabin steps. The air was cool. The silence felt full, not lonely. He thought about how the women had trusted him, even if only for one night. Trust was not given easily. It was earned in moments when words were unnecessary. Days later, he came across a situation that tested him. Near the edge of the open land, he found a traveler struggling with a damaged vehicle. The person looked tired and unsure, clearly unprepared for the distance and conditions. Without hesitation, the cowboy stopped. He offered water, calm words, and assistance. He helped secure the vehicle and guided the traveler toward a safer route. As he worked, he remembered the woman's words about being seen when you do not know you are being watched. He did not act differently because of that memory. He acted the same way he always had. But now he understood the weight those moments carried. The traveler thanked him and moved on. The cowboy stood for a moment longer, watching the dust settle. He felt grounded, certain. That evening, as he returned to the cabin, he noticed something placed carefully near the door. It was small and simple, made from natural materials. It was not flashy or decorative. It felt intentional. He did not need an explanation. He picked it up gently and placed it inside. It was not a gift meant to be owned, but a reminder meant to be kept. A sign of respect, left quietly without ceremony. From that day on, the cabin became more than just shelter. It became a place of connection between land people and quiet understanding. The cowboy found himself opening his door more often, not to crowds, but to moments. To those who needed rest, guidance, or simply a safe pause. He never spoke about that stormy night unless asked, and even then he shared it simply. No dramatic details, just the truth of it. Some nights when storms returned, he would sit by the fire and listen. The rain no longer sounded the same. It carried memory now. It carried voices, footsteps, and shared silence. He realized that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived quietly, asked for shelter, and left behind a deeper sense of purpose. And so, the cowboy continued his life, changed but steady. Alone but not disconnected. Watching the land, respecting it, and understanding now that every path crossed for a reason, even if only for a single night. Time moved forward as it always did, slow and steady across the land. Seasons changed. The air grew colder, then warmer again. The cowboy's days followed familiar patterns, but his heart carried something new, something quiet, something lasting. The small item left near his cabin door stayed inside, placed carefully on a wooden shelf. He did not treat it as decoration. He treated it as a reminder. Whenever he looked at it, he remembered the storm, the knock on the door, and the calm strength of those women who had trusted him without many words. The land continued to test him, as it always had. There were long days of work, short nights of rest, and moments when the silence felt heavy. But now, the silence also felt meaningful. It reminded him that he was part of something larger than his cabin or his routine. One evening, another storm rolled in. Not as fierce as the first, but strong enough to command attention. The cowboy prepared as usual, secured the windows, checked the fire, and sat quietly. As rain tapped against the roof, his thoughts returned to that night long ago. He realized something important. The storm had not changed his life by bringing visitors. It had changed his life by reminding him who he already was. He had always believed in helping when he could, in listening more than speaking, in respecting the land and the people who moved through it. The women had simply reflected that back to him, allowing him to see the value of his own choices more clearly. Days later, he met others on the land, travelers, workers, families passing through. He treated each with the same quiet respect. Some stayed only a moment. Some stayed longer. Each left something behind, even if it was only a shared glance or a simple thank you. Word slowly spread, not through stories or praise, but through experience. People spoke of a man in a small cabin who helped without judgment, who listened without pressing, who understood the land and respected those who walked upon it. The cowboy did not seek recognition. He never corrected anyone or added details. He believed that truth carried itself forward without help. One morning, while walking near the edge of his land, he noticed familiar tracks again. He smiled softly. He did not follow them. He did not need to. Some paths were meant to cross only once, yet their meaning lasted far longer. As the sun rose higher, he stood still and listened to the land. Wind moved through the grass. Birds lifted into the sky. Everything felt balanced. He thought about the woman who had whispered those words and what they truly meant. She had not claimed anything. She had recognized something, and that recognition had traveled both ways. The cowboy returned to his cabin and opened the door. The fire waited to be lit. The space felt warm, even before the flames began. He knew now that shelter was more than walls and roofs. It was the willingness to open a door when it mattered. Years later, when his hair had turned lighter and his steps slower, the memory of that night remained clear. Not sharp, not painful, just true. If anyone ever asked him what had changed his life, he did not mention the storm or the visitors. He said only that sometimes the land sends you a reminder of who you are, and you must be ready to listen. As evening settled once more, the cowboy sat by his door and watched the horizon. The sky held the same colors it always had, but he saw them differently now. Somewhere beyond the trees, paths continued, people moved, stories unfolded. And in a small cabin on quiet land, a man lived with understanding, knowing that a single night, shared in trust and respect, could echo across a lifetime without ever needing to be spoken aloud.